For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini, author, senior lecturer in Department of Historic and Heritage Studies, and an editor of South African Historical Journal. Dr Thula Simpson discusses his latest book titled Umkhonto Sizwe, the ANC's Armed Struggle. Welcome, Dr. Simpson.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Umkhonto Sizwe, that we know as MK, was an ANC and SACP's iconic military wing in the South African anti-apartheid struggle, led by great men like Nelson Mandela. What does your book tell readers about the role of the MK, about the role that MK played in advancing the struggle? Was its contribution military or politically?
It's both. What I wanted to do with the book was write the first detailed study of the entirety of the ANC's armed struggle. And where the book starts is in the 1950s, with the first move towards non-violence by the ANC, and it goes all the way through to Nelson Mandela's election and the political settlement which creates the foundations of the new South Africa. So there's 4 decades in between of very hard-fought political and military warfare, and both of them are fused in the struggle.
And you also mentioned that some of the unsung heroes in the book. Who would you say fascinated you while you were doing your research?
Well, there's really 3 levels of heroes who are dealt with in the book. The book has things to say about people about whom things have been written before. For example, the most written about South African, perhaps, of the late 20th century, Nelson Mandela. It speaks about his role in the drive towards armed struggle, and later with his role as the founder of Umkhonto Sizwe. But beyond people like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Chris Hani and Joe Slovo, there's a whole list of other names, people like Barney Molokwane, Lux Martin Gudle, Ahmed Timol, Ashley Creel, Basil February, about whom much is said, but not very much has been written. Little or nothing has been written about them. Solomon Mahlangu, who's been in the news over the past couple of days with the controversy between the EFF and the ANC. And what the book also tells us is something about the individuals behind the street names or statues of the new South Africa. It helps us explain where they fall in with the broader history of South Africa. And then there's a whole list of names in the book who have been neither written about nor commemorated, but the book really goes through the entirety of South Africa, and these are local histories of what's going on in the struggle against apartheid, basically from the Cape all the way up to the Limpopo, of people involved in the struggle and caught up in extraordinary times and events which made headlines across the world. So it's an all South African story, and it features individuals, both insurgents and counterinsurgents, and civilians as well, on all sides of the conflict who are caught up in the conflict, and it speaks about their contribution.
And there's an interesting part in the book where some of the ANC leaders didn't agree with the decision to form an armed struggle within the ANC. Can you reflect on the debates that took place during that period?
You know, it was in the early years of the 2000s, in the previous decade, and what initially got me interested in studying Umkhonto Sizwe's history is that I read the Founding Manifesto, and it's a declaration of war which has a difference, because there's statements about how the ANC, by taking up and establishing Umkhonto Sizwe, wants to actually avoid civil war with in South Africa. There's this idea that it's Verwoerd and the nationalists who are making plans for civil war and military dictatorship, and one of the things Umkhonto Sizwe is set out to help achieve is preventing that from happening. And so you've got things like the Founding Manifesto of MK. You've also got the first phase of MK operations, where operations were supposed to not extract blood. They were supposed to be bloodless operations, avoid civilian casualties. And even in the late 1980s, you've got the debate about soft and hard targets. That's a discussion which runs through the entirety of the ANC's armed struggle. And I think it's got relevance for the present day in 2016. I mean, the armed struggle is long over, but we've got conflicts around the world. And this debate which took place in the South African struggle of the limits of violence and how far you take violence before it becomes self-defeating is something which I think South Africa has to say, and it's got relevance to the wider world.
And which former Umkhonto Sizwe operations would you regard as having the most substantial impact?
The seminal operations, there are a number. I think the Sasol operation in 1980 that was a operation which made headlines across the world, and it really gave an indication of the effectiveness of Umkhonto Sizwe. But there are also many famous episodes which marked turning points or watersheds in the struggle. Something like the Church Street bombing would be one of them. There's also the killing of the firebombing of Inkihoyi's house in the Transkei in 1962, where that was a case where there really was an attack on the individual lives. So there's a number of operations. It's a book which covers operations over really a 30-year period, and all of the major operations, like the Silverton siege, for example, is another one which is there. The Gosh Street shooting, which involves Solomon Mahlangu. All of these incidents are part of the story, and a lot more.
And it took you a long time to finish the book. Compiling this kind of book must have required extensive research as well. What were the challenges while you were compiling it?
Well, there's basically three phases of the research. It was first, when I discussed the question earlier about the limits of violence, that was a PhD which I did at the University of London. The second phase was really a postdoc, because my PhD focused on that one question of the armed struggle. But whilst researching it, I became aware that there's a number of other questions which are of interest and significance. And I got a postdoc at the University of Pretoria, and I got the opportunity to write and research more. And during that phase, that was a really important phase, because I was able to go to Swaziland, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, the UK, all over South Africa. So really that access to the University of Pretoria's funding during the postdoc period enabled me to do the bulk of the research, and that was a really crucial period from about 2007 to 2012. And then from that, with the research material having been compiled, from 2012 roughly to the present, that's involved actually writing the book.
We also know that our President Jacob Zuma was also recruited to join the MK in 1963. What role do you know that he's played in the MK?
Well, he's played roles at all of the levels of the armed struggle. When you mentioned that he was sent abroad to undergo training, he was part of a convoy which was arrested before it could before it got to the border. At that stage, he's a very young, I think in his early 20s, young cadre of the movement. Throughout the course of the subsequent stages of the struggle, he rises up in positions of prominence. He becomes, for example, the chief representative of the ANC in Maputo, one of the most important fronts of the armed struggle, where he's the ANC's leading diplomat, for want of a better word, during that period. And he plays an important role there. And after 1990, when we've got the war between the ANC and the Inkatha in the Reef, but also in Natal, he's one of the most important peacemakers there as well. And people often say that he is a figure who's basically been made by the ANC. And I think you see in the book his rise through the ranks, and that's something you see with a lot of the leaders of the new South Africa, as it's described in the book. They make their first entrance onto the pages of history in the armed struggle, and they rise throughout the movement, and it sets the stage for their subsequent post-1994 roles. So that's one of the important contributions of the book in terms of understanding the South Africa of 2016.
And what was your aim in writing this book?
My aim in writing this book is that when it came to the stage of 2012, as I said, when I wanted to focus on writing the book, I'd been researching the history of the ANC and the ANC's armed struggle for a few years, and I felt that what I had on my hands was one of the great stories of the 20th century. I mean, you always read great history books. That's what got me interested in history, these big books on major episodes in history, like the World Wars and the Russian Revolution and the American Civil War. And this was one which took place in Southern Africa, and perhaps because it's an African story, it's been relatively unwritten. And I felt that here were the elements of a great narrative in terms of the drama of the events, the cast of characters, and the significance of the events in terms of either opening, as in the Russian Revolution, which opened the era of communism worldwide, or the American Civil War, which is basically the death knell of slavery as a global phenomenon. In terms of the struggles against colonialism and white minority rule, which are taking place throughout much of Asia and Africa, the South African struggles are really symbolic one, and you see at the end of the book it's a sort of gathering of the international community, one of the largest that they've had, and they're sort of saying goodbye to an era of world history. So I felt that here's a great narrative, and here's one worth focusing on, and I wanted to do it.
Thank you very much. And lastly, what can we expect from you in future?
You know, one of the things that struck me whilst writing the book is that it would have been really good to have a sort of general history of South Africa which could service the more specific study, so I could have some kind of context for the sort of specific, detailed, local, contingent events that I'm speaking about. And I would be interested, not that it's going to materialize anytime soon, and maybe not even in the long future. That's why I'm reluctant about committing myself to a definite answer. But I think that a general history of South Africa would be a really interesting, complementary and next project to undertake.
Well, good luck in future. That was Dr. Thula Simpson speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled Umkhonto Sizwe, the ANC's Armed Struggle.